Hi, welcome to the Also Called podcast, where we're asking hard questions about our place in this hectic world.
Join us as we dig into the truth about who God is, possibly discovering that we are also called.
Guys, I am super excited about this episode. We have invited Allison in. She is going to talk to us about the neuroscience, the psychology of Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was possessed by 7 demons, and she ran into Jesus. Jesus healed her, and then she just became part of the crew. So she was a disciple. She hung out with Jesus and the disciples and traveled and did all the things. And I am super excited about this one because I've started listening to this podcast, The Exorcist Files. And we're going to link it in the show notes. We're going to link specifically a conversation that they have about mental illness, demonic oppression. So that may be way outside of some of your comfort zones, but it's really exciting to me. Allison, we are going to have you introduce yourself with Allison. Allison is joining us and going to give her perspective on that. So Allison, would you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm originally from Mississippi, and as a teenager, I moved to Georgia, lived there for quite a long time, then moved to Florida, and I'm now currently building my practice in Florida, where I had one in Georgia for many years. So I'm really excited to be a part of this project. It just, to me, really brings out something that a lot of women, I think, maybe didn't really understand, and just a place to go to. Really, it almost is a resource to understand all the different women that have a part in Jesus's mission.
Thank you. Allison, what is it that drew you to being a part of the Other Disciples project?
To me, I really feel like these women are such an integral part of what Jesus did, and that they came alongside of him and in a lot of ways financially made sure that he was able to do what God called him to do, and that they really are another disciple alongside of all of the men that were participating.
So Allison, what drew you to writing about Mary of Magdala?
Well, I kind of felt like it was a challenge because it is kind of an interesting topic that maybe a lot of people have not thought about or really dug into and discovered what's the truth here. Trauma is something that people talk about a lot. Unfortunately, sometimes people misuse the word. However, as a counselor, I do work with a lot of people who have trauma, whether that's, a one-time instance of something that's very physical, like a hurricane or a car accident or something like that, or over a long period of time, relational type trauma within their family, or even someone outside of their family that's perpetrated some type of abuse that's caused trauma as well.
What did you enjoy most about writing about her, or what did you relate to most in her story?
The fact that we don't know a whole lot about her, and so that leaves a lot to the imagination. We know that Jesus brought the 7 demons out of her, and we can just imagine what her life was like before that and how much of a struggle she had. But the gratitude and, just dedication to someone who was willing to just come along and say, out, no more, that your life is not going to look like that anymore. Obviously, she was very close to Jesus all throughout his ministry. We can understand why.
Tell us exactly what trauma is and why something may be traumatic to one person and not necessarily another.
With trauma, it's good to define it because, like I said, sometimes that word is used inappropriately, for something that may be very minor. Trauma is actually a deeply distressing and disturbing emotional experience, and it has a negative effect on our ability to process it emotionally. It actually, the whole situation kind of stays in a part of our brain where it's not being processed. It's just a part of almost our everyday life and our everyday decisions. For one person, it there are so many different factors that come into play as to why someone would experience traumatic stress symptoms and another person would not and may be experiencing the exact same thing. One factor is the age of when the experience happens. The younger it is, depending on how much they understand about what they're experiencing, it may not become traumatic for them, or it may be more traumatic because they don't understand. It depends on the person and what their experiences have already been, and possibly even if they've already had previous traumas. That certainly can intensify an experience and cause them to have more symptoms based on the fact that they've had multiple traumatic experiences. Also, we know that support is something that's important for anyone, but especially for someone who is going through something traumatic. If they have more support at that time, potentially they're going to develop less symptoms, not experience the traumatic stress that someone else would.
How much would you say resiliency plays into when we experience trauma to bounce back from that? Is somebody who's resilient going to have it less, or it's still traumatic?
Yeah, I would say that someone who's resilient and has learned those ways of kind of processing and managing things that they're experiencing is going to have less symptoms. Not that it didn't kind of stay in their brain the same way, but they're going to show less symptoms outwardly. And so therefore most people would look at that and say, oh, well, maybe it didn't really bother them. We don't know until, we're on the other side with Jesus and he can say, yes, they were still bothered. They just didn't show symptoms the way someone else did.
The trauma isn't the experience. The trauma is how you respond to the experience.
Yes.
So The Body Keeps the Score is a great book if you really nerd out on this stuff.
Yes, yes, exactly. The beginning of the book is like, whoa, wait a minute.
I had to make graphs and charts when I read it.
I do tell some people to skip that part if they're not like really into that.
Yeah.
Move on to the next part.
Yeah. So what brought it to mind though is one story specifically is the husband and wife that were in a car accident together and they had completely different responses to it. So that came to mind when you were talking about how people respond differently.
Right.
So can we talk a little bit, shift into the neuroscience? What does our brain look like on trauma?
Well, for one, like I said, it stays in our prefrontal cortex and it actually kind of drives some of our reactions and our behaviors and even some of our thoughts until it is processed. Once it's processed, we are able to let go of some of those survival responses, is the term that I use in my counseling practice. But the different parts of our brain, obviously the amygdala, when you go through something traumatic, it incites that fight or flight process. It can also be responsible for emotional regulation. So someone you see who has a hard time kind of coming down from being very agitated or very upset about something may have experienced some trauma and really has a difficult time kind of bringing themselves back to that good place. The hippocampus also, because it records our memories, it's very spotty in trauma. So it often is going to be like flashes rather than a story. That also you'll see when people try to tell a story, especially when they were very young. The memories are spotty. They're like, I remember the curtains in that room. And they know something bad happened, but other than that, they can't really tell you the story.
Is that our brain trying to protect itself?
Absolutely. That's the beauty of how God has created us. He has created our brain to have one major function is to protect us, is to kind of put that barrier in between us and all those traumatic experiences so that until he is ready for us to begin to process that, his timing. So with a lot of people, it's after they've had kids and been married and have gotten into a different stage of life, maybe, kind of pushed through a career and kind of hanging in that area where things have kind of steadied out often that's when trauma will start to bubble up and they're ready to process it. And it's because God's designed it that way. Like I said, with the prefrontal cortex, it actually looks like physical changes in our brain. They can take a scan of your brain and see that, oh, okay, this person has likely experienced some trauma. They might not know exactly what, but there's differences in what our brain looks like after we've experienced trauma. It does actually make an impact. But the beauty is as we process that, our brain can then become whole and healthy again.
That is amazing. Wow.
I love that. I think we're going to have so many resources in the show notes for this one, because that reminded me of a podcast I listened to, Therapy and Theology, with Lisa Durhurst. And she was talking about, her process through trauma, and she had brain scans and all that kind of stuff. But I was also thinking about this book that I read, You're Not Broken. It's by Dr. Sarah Woodhouse. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
No.
But she wrote a lot about trauma. People say big T trauma or little t trauma, and she likes to say little t trauma and other T trauma rather than big T, because each individual, back to kind of what we were talking about before and how your brain protects you, it's not so much about the circumstance or the events that was experienced. It's more about the individual and what their response to that event is, what we would consider trauma.
Absolutely. Those survival responses that develop because we've had to go through something.
It makes me sad as a Gen Xer, and I'm sure the boomers and earlier went through that whole attitude of there's something wrong with you because you didn't just bounce back from a traumatic, we didn't even call it trauma back then. It's shake it off, you're fine, you're not bleeding. But it just really makes me sad how many traumatic experiences were responded to that way, which re-traumatizes you all over again. Because it makes you feel like there's something wrong with you, that your body is responding away, or you're crying and you don't have control over that. So I love that you and so many others in this generation are setting people free, understanding the physiology of, most of the time, this isn't even something we can control.
Right.
I love that we're talking about the generational thing. Sometimes things are not within our control. So I mentioned earlier the Exorcist Files, that podcast, and Dr. Sean Tobin. He is not a Catholic priest, but he is a mental health professional. He was talking about an experience with one of his clients who was going through exorcism. So again, I am interested in all types of denominations. So if we're freaking any of our Protestant or unbeliever friends out, just hang with me. It's interesting stuff. An exorcism isn't like the movies and it's just a one and done kind of thing. Usually it's a progressive. The same thing with therapy. You don't go to your counselor one time and everything is done. So in this episode, he talked about one of his clients who were going through multiple sessions. And it wasn't until they were going through some visualization kind of stuff and going back to that time of the trauma and invited Jesus into that memory. By inviting Jesus into that memory, it was like instantaneous healing. It was a great episode, and it was just so powerful, the healing that we can have mentally and emotionally when we invite Jesus into that space. If you believe in spiritual warfare, to whatever degree you believe it, trauma oftentimes is the entry point for oppression, if you want to start talking about, the spiritual level of that. So what are some techniques that, as a therapist, you use with your clients to work through a traumatic experience?
Well, I have been working with people and their trauma for over 14 years now. So I've used a lot of different techniques, but some of the things that have really kind of stayed with me and seem to work the most with people is, one, giving them a safe and compassionate place to tell their story if they're ready to. They may have never told anyone what they've experienced. They may have either been so ashamed or so scared to talk about it again. So giving them that place to tell the story, but then after they've done that, after they've kind of released some of that in their story, we've got to break down the experience into small pieces, because the reason why it didn't process to begin with, the reason why it's stuck in that part of our brain, is it's too big. Our brain doesn't process things that way. Our brain processes things in smaller pieces. And so if I can break down what's happened to them based on the facts of what happened, the emotions that they experienced, the values that were violated by what happened, things that they believed about the world that were supposed to be true, that didn't work out that way when they experienced trauma. And then the losses that they experienced, almost like grieving based on what I've been through. I grieve things like trust for people after what I've been through, maybe even trust in myself and my own judgment, things like that, that often we don't even look at and recognize, hey, things have changed for me. I've lost some things because I went through this. Also, then, like you said, the person's responses, those are huge. That's where the trauma sets in, is what did I think about? How did I interpret what happened to me? Did I believe certain things about the other people involved, or about myself, or maybe even about God, because I went through this? And then the behaviors that I had in response. Maybe after that, I isolated. I stayed away from people because maybe I'd lost trust, or I cried a lot because I felt like that was the only way to get all of that out of me, is just to let it come out. And for some people, that is a part of the healing process. Those survival responses, those responses that we had to trauma, often get in our way later on. They served us during the trauma to survive, why I call them survival responses. But later on, they actually get in our way and cause problems in relationships, problems in maybe keeping a job, things like that, that because I'm isolating and maybe, not getting up in the morning or withdrawing from people, I'm having a hard time in my career, or I'm having a hard time, connecting with my spouse because certain things have changed in me based on what I experienced. And so that's a big part of the healing, is acknowledging what were those survival responses and do they help me now?
I love that, because exactly what you were saying a little bit earlier, God sets the timing of going, okay, it's time to let go of those trauma responses.
Mhm.
There's an Australian writer that I really love. Her name is Anne Hamilton, and she says those trauma responses are called false refuges or false idols. It's
Right.
things we run to instead of God because it
Mhm.
kept us safe at that time. But God wants to take those back from us and go, well, let me give you a healthy way to start living instead of running to sleeping,
Mhm.
12 to 16 hours a day, or
Right.
overeating, or, whatever our trauma response is.
As you process what you've experienced and breaking it down in those small pieces, that's when the healing begins, and where you start to see those survival responses kind of drop off. Almost like, where did they go? I'm not doing that anymore. And that's God. It's only Him can, help you let go of things that you've held on so tightly to because you believed it worked.
So, as a Christian therapist, how can you tell if it's more than just trauma?
I would say that is a very tricky question, because in my practice, someone actually would not be coming to me if their problem was to that extent. They would probably be going to their pastor or their priest for a mental hospital. However, as a Christian, I know that spiritual warfare is real, and that if I started to see these behaviors, these symptoms of demonic oppression, I would definitely ask the person, hey, what do you think about this idea? Could this be in play in what you're struggling with? to this day, I have not personally had someone that I suspected that of, but I know that the symptoms are very obvious and scary. Unfortunately, some people have kind of related it to things like dissociative identity disorder and kind of mixed those two together. And often, it could be misdiagnosed in a mental hospital where someone actually is dealing with spiritual warfare and oppression. I know that all of these things are true. I've not actually experienced it myself, and I can say thank you, God, for not letting me experience that.
But looking back just over my experience and after listening to some of these podcasts and other people talking about spiritual warfare and things, I look back at my life and I think I was there was spiritual warfare happening then, not to the point of full on possession. But this kind of goes back to something we were talking about earlier with healing in different stages and where you are spiritually and how that works together. I was going to a therapist for, probably 8 years or so before I ever mentioned to my therapist, oh, by the way, since we've healed everything else, maybe we should talk about the fact that as a child I was sexually abused. And I haven't even told my parents about it. So maybe we can talk about that now. There's this one thing in front of your face, whether it was anger or alcoholism or whatever the case may be.
Right.
And it's, you, like you said, it's different levels. You have to break the things down piece by piece and deal with one thing at a time.
Right.
And I think looking back, just using myself as an example, I definitely see the spiritual aspect along with the therapy and the personal growth and the understanding of why I'm responding this way. And it all goes hand in hand.
So bringing the conversation back around to Mary Magdalene, looking at her, what do you feel like what you see in her story?
I know that God's word is true. And so I believe what is written in the Bible, that Jesus took 7 demons out of her. Just knowing that that was her struggle before she met Jesus and how much her life changed, she became very dedicated to his ministry because she had experienced healing and wholeness herself. And it wasn't something that she saw at a distance, someone else being healed and wondering, what's that like? She actually experienced it herself and knew firsthand, hey, he can do amazing things. I'm going with him.
I can only imagine the liberation that she would have felt being actually demon possessed by 7 demons. Because I, have felt the freedom and the lightness of your spirit just through therapy and prayer. So I can only imagine. So what did you learn from Mary's story?
That Jesus is the healer, whether that's a mental healing or a physical healing that we require, and that we seek him and his truth in the word, that we can be healed and be made whole by our relationship with him. I myself have experienced healing and restoration through counseling with someone who was very knowledgeable about the Bible and was able to incorporate that and God's truth into that. And, I could not imagine living the way I lived before then. That, like you said, that freedom that you experience afterwards, that you're not stuck in those same behaviors and same patterns over and over to exhaustion. I know that the more I seek him and his healing, that the more I become who he created me to be, not who the world or trauma, unfortunately, has shaped me to be in the past, that I can actually live out of that true understanding of who God is and how much he loves me. and his plan for my life, and that I can rest in that.
That's beautiful. I love it. And same thing, having been set free from things myself, you can't even describe all the freedom and the weight that's gone from being a slave to your behavior or a slave to your feelings. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much, Allison. We just thank you so much for being a part of this and having this conversation. And just want to invite our audience that this is just the beginning of the conversation. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Mary of Magdala. So drop us a line in the comments, or for the larger conversation, check out our social media. The links are below in our show notes. And join us next time as we explore more women from our book, The Other Disciples. So stay curious
and keep seeking.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Also Called provides a space for honest conversations about the truth of who God is, who we are, and the relationships He wants us to have with Him, each other, the church, and ourselves. This episode was just the start of the conversation. Be sure to check the show notes for extra resources to go further. You can also find our social media sites to join the discussion. Don't miss our next chat by subscribing to our YouTube channel or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Also Called is part of Bible and Pop Culture, a crowd-funded nonprofit that allows us to provide our content to start great conversations for free. You can help us keep doing this by checking out BibleandPopCulture.com or AlsoCalled.org's donate subscribe buttons with a one-time gift, supporting us monthly, or sharing us with someone who might like the conversation. Thank you for being a part, and see you next conversation.